Adam Gopnik has served as a staff writer for The New Yorker since 1986. His expanded collection of essays from Paris, Paris to the Moon, appeared in 2000 and was called by the New York Times the finest book on France in recent years. His 2006 book, Through the Children's Gate, A Home in New York, collected and expanded his essays from previous 5 years about life in New York and about raising 2 children in the shadow of many kinds of sadness. His 2009 book, Angels and Ages, a short book about Lincoln, Darwin, and modern life, was a national bestseller. He is also the author of The Steps Across the Water, At the Stranger's Gate, The Table Comes First, The King and the Window, and many others, in addition to his amazing writing over the years in the New Yorker magazine. He's won the National Magazine Award for Essays and Criticism 3 times, as well as the George Polk Award for Magazine Reporting and the Canadian National Magazine Award Gold Medal for Arts Writing. He's also spoken on town hall stages several times. He is really one of the core reasons why this space exists, a public intellectual who engages with all aspects of life. And tonight, I think we're all thinking a little bit about politics in the last couple of years in new ways. He is returning to us with this new text and a somewhat new subject for him, A Thousand Small Sanities, the moral adventure of liberalism, the subject of tonight's talk. Please join me in giving a warm town hall welcome to Adam Gopnik.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Now comes the nightly humiliation. I'll just take it off its stand so I won't have to lower it in front of all of you. There's no speaker on the public circuit who goes lower on the mic than I have to. It is wonderful to be back here at Town Hall. It's wonderful to be back in Seattle. The last time I was here in Seattle, some of you may remember, I was doing a version of a one-man show that I had worked out with storytelling. Someone was here for that. And I mention that because it reminds me of what a very different moment that was, trivially in my life, but significantly in the life of all of us, in the life of our country. It was a time of a lighter heart, or a higher heart at least. I was in the middle at that moment of working on a musical comedy, actually. That was my preoccupation at that time. I was as far from the world of politics as I could be. I had written a musical comedy with the great composer David Shire called Our Table, about a couple striving to keep a restaurant going in New York City. And we had just finished a run of it. The 11 o'clock number of that show, I should tell you. Does everyone here know what an 11 o'clock is? Some lady here, a gentleman here knows what it is. It's the big number at the end of every show. Like If Ever I Should Leave You in Camelot, or What I Did for Love in a chorus line, call it 11 o'clock, because traditionally at 11 o'clock is when you had that number, when the curtain used to be at 8 p.m. in the Broadway theater. Now it's really at 10 o'clock. But that's the big number. The big 11 o'clock number in our show was called It's Never Raining in Seattle. That's true, because the whole premise of it was, and you should go on YouTube, you can hear it, beautifully sung by Melissa Errico and Graham Rowett, because the whole premise of the show was that eventually they were going to have to leave New York and come run a coffee bar in Seattle, and the father kept lying to the little girl, saying that it always rained in Seattle, and finally at the end he has to persuade her that it never rains in Seattle. He had been making it up all that time. And that speaks to the story, to the ride, the voyage I want to take you on tonight, because it begins with my lying to my daughter. All of us who are parents, not just by genetics, but by vocation, spend an inordinate amount of time, I think, lying to our children, falsely reassuring them when we have to, telling them, trust me, I know, when they can't trust you and you don't know. And this tale begins on one of those occasions. It's election night in 2016, and my then 17-year-old daughter, Olivia, is materially decomposing in front of my eyes as we watch the election returns come in. Some of you may recall what that night was like. the passage from confidence to doubt. It was rather like a Western man's discovery of the non-existence of God. It went from slight skepticism to full-on panic and ended finally in despair. And I'm watching Olivia fragmenting. I'm watching see that she's clearly fraught. She's, in her own language, freaked out. And Olivia's a bright girl and terrifically political, as so many young women of her generation are. And she wasn't traumatized, nor would I have encouraged her or sympathized had she been traumatized by the change in the party in power. One of the things we learn and accept in a democracy is that there will always be an oscillation of the parties in power, and not only is that a thing you have to accept, it's a thing that in every sense you have to embrace and even rejoice in. I've always thought one of the most beautiful moments in our recent political history was on the night in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected president and John McCain spoke eloquently and with enormous dignity. Perhaps the last time we could associate those two words with a candidate for that particular office from that side. But nonetheless, he spoke with great eloquence and dignity about the nobility of the change of parties and change of ideologies in a democracy. So I wouldn't have sympathized with her for a second had that been the source of her distraught quality that night. It was not that our team was losing. No, it was her sense, which I understood and identified with, that some terrible new thing had entered the world, an authoritarian instinct, an autocratic pattern, and one that was alloyed with what could only be called predation, an enormously predatory kind. And it seemed in a matter of hours to disarm, disprove, refute all of the values that we had been teaching her, and I had been teaching her in particular, for the first 17 years of her life. So I said to her, baby, let's just go outside and we'll just go for a long walk together. Turn off the television and we'll just go out for a walk. And I put my arm around her. She's taller than I am too. And we went for a walk. And we walked around the blocks of our Manhattan neighborhood. And I reaffirmed the liberal and humanist values that I believed in, that I had been taught by my own father, and that I had tried to teach her and her brother. I pointed out all the significant instances in history where what had seemed to be an enormous blow to values and opportunities had turned around eventually. I reminded her that no one politician, good or bad, could make or unmake our lives. Barack Obama did not make your sandwiches in the morning, I pointed out to her. You did. I even showed her some significant historical instances which she could draw on for reassurance and relief and even inspiration on this dark and traumatic night. And we got back to the house with her chin up and her spirits lifted. Not one bit. Not even slightly. I failed about as badly as a human being can fail to convey a single reassuring idea or put a single positive thought in her head. In fact, by the time I was about 20 minutes in, I could see that she had turned all of her attention to her phone, as every 17-year-old girl does, and was being reassured, if any reassurance was possible, by the steady streams of OMFGs from all of her friends cascading onto her phone, which was exploding like a small incandescent firecracker in her hand. But I made a note. I made a mental memorandum on that evening that somehow I would stop in the midst of all the non-political things that I write and try and articulate and compose and offer, to write a letter to Olivia, my daughter, about liberalism, about what it meant to be a liberal, and why I was proud to call myself a liberal in a time when nobody wanted the name at all. Because there is no worse name you can call anyone right now than a liberal. Liberalism and liberals are treated with disdain very often on both sides. That's why we try and change the name. You become a progressive or a positive person, something else. Not good to be a liberal. The last time it was glamorous to be a liberal was, I think, in a brief arc of time between late 1960 and early 1962. Since then, not so good. But I embrace the name. Now, I embrace it, and this would be the first thing I'd want to tell Olivia, recognizing the countless uses and varying meanings that it's had in the last 200 or 300 years of human history. That's a positive thing. Any term worth taking up, any role worth exploring, is always going to be roomy, spacious, reiterated in surprising ways. That's true whether it's fullback or liberal or surgeon. It covers an enormous range of human activities. But it's certainly true that to be a liberal now is far too often, I thought, to Olivia's generation, to be identified with a weak centrist, to be identified with a limp compromiser, to be seen as someone who lacks all spine and nerve and appetite for the fight. And liberal, in the popular imagination, is a guy who, in a bar fight, when everyone else is throwing bourbon bottles, tries to start a tasting of artisanal bourbon in the midst of it. That's our image of the liberal. And I wanted to give Olivia another sense of the genealogy, the family tree, the history, the taxonomy of what I meant by liberalism. And I began to imagine for her, I began to imagine on her behalf a kind of ride that I would take her on, a trip I could take her on through history, not through abstract ideas and dry principles, but to meet people, particular people who had devoted their lives to the moral adventure of liberalism, not to the narrow contractual haggling with which liberalism is sometimes represented. No, to the extraordinary secular and spiritual journey for fairness, equality, compassion, decency, opportunity, education, prosperity, and peace. I wanted her to meet those people. I began to imagine for her a kind of liberal Pirates of the Caribbean ride that I could take her on. And we would go down together, and she would meet some of my heroes and some of my heroines. The first people I knew that I wanted Olivia to meet on this ride were a simple, sort of plain pair of English people. That was the greatest of liberal philosophers, John Stuart Mill, and his great teacher and lover, and eventually, but all too briefly, his wife, Harriet Taylor. It's the 1830s. It's the 1830s in London, and the two of them have fallen in love. Now, she's married and has children. He's unmarried, and they've fallen in love, and they've begun a clandestine courtship together, a clandestine, amorous, and intellectual courtship, and possibly erotic too. No one really knows for sure. They had gone off to Paris together briefly, and in my theory of life is no one goes to Paris with another person and stays in a hotel and has no erotic aura connected with it. But Mill denied it his whole life, and I love him, so I will accept his denial. But they were certainly courting, they were madly in love, and they recognized the difficulty of their circumstances if they were seen together constantly, all the time, a married woman and an unmarried philosopher. So they used to go courting, I wanted to tell Olivia, they used to go courting on the bench in the London Zoo outside the rhinoceros cage. They would slip each other notes. Let's meet by our old friend Rhino. I think our old friend Rhino is waiting for us today. And they would go off and they would meet secretly because they had figured out, it's a very good thing to be a trained philosopher, they had created the syllogism that when you are in front of a rhinoceros cage, everyone else is looking at the rhinoceros. No one is looking at the courting clandestine couple sitting on the bench outside the rhinoceros cage. They were effectively invisible, rendered invisible by the cloak of the amazing rhinoceros. And they would sit there on that bench together in secret, and they would talk about ideas. They would talk about the ideas that were burning in their hearts, ideas of progress and fairness and liberty and equality. John Stuart Mill always said to anyone who asked him throughout his entire life that Harriet Taylor was the smartest woman, smartest human being he had ever met, was the greatest teacher he had ever had, and the finest philosopher he had ever encountered. And for 150 years, no one believed him. Effectively, scholarship yokoed Harriet Taylor, if I can invent a verb. Everyone said John was so in love with her that he failed to see her limitations. But fortunately, new generations of feminist scholarship have shown us just what a remarkable mind Harriet Taylor had, and that she was every bit as equal and engaged in their work together as John Stuart Mill always said that she was. And while they were sitting there, this courting couple, deeply in love, clandestinely in love, on that bench, I wanted to tell Olivia, they came up with the ideas, not for one, but for two consciousness-changing, world-shaking books. One of them, of course, was the book called On Liberty, John Stuart Mill's great testament to the necessity of liberty without constraints for all. His great text insisting that there was no idea in the world, particularly religious ideas, that were too perfect not to be worthy of scrutiny, that ideas only improved when we criticized or examined them, that the act of speaking freely was always valuable, and that no one's speech could possibly harm me or harm the values that we shared, because those values would only become better armed by virtue of being engaged in a verbal duel. Greatest statement of the necessity of liberty without constraints that's ever existed. He would publish it eventually in 1859, always gave Harriet Taylor half the credit. By the way, in 1859, it was the same year and on the same publisher's list that Darwin published On the Origin of Species. That's a very good year for a publisher. But on that same bench and at that same time, they came up with the thoughts and the arguments, the ideas, under Harriet's impetus particularly, that would emerge as still another great book. The book that they signed together called On the Subjection of Women. It was published later. It was thought through first, and it was very much Harriet's idea. She was married to a well-meaning but rather simple, rather foolish man named John Taylor, and she talked with rage about how a woman in Victorian England was subject to having her entire selfhood removed by the simple act of being married. She lost her name, her money, her independence, her existence, in some sense, by the simple act of being subjected to the will of a man. And John and Harriet, sitting there on that bench, realized and insisted that there should be no bounds, no boundaries on a woman's rights. Not merely that women should be treated better or that women should have access to education or should occasionally be allowed to participate in public debate. No, they insisted staunchly and absolutely that women had to have exactly the same set of rights that men possess, the same set of opportunities and the same set of obligations. It's a vision of gender equality, as we would call it now, that we're still working out. We've still scarcely fully achieved. Think of it, those two sitting there on that bench outside the rhinoceros cage. And think once more, take one more deep dive into that image, I would have wanted to say to Olivia. Because if you think about it, those two books, those two sets of ideas, represent things that are in some ways very different. John Stuart Mill's great book on liberty is a call for freedom, call for individual liberty without constraint. On the Subjection of Women, the great book they negotiated together is a call for the equality of people, a call for using the state, using the government to create greater equality among people. Their vision of liberalism, and they always identified as liberals, was not simply the liberty of the individual, nor was it the equality of all. It was the two things at once. And that was the core conception that they had, that there was no contradiction between insisting on the liberty of each of us and insisting equally on the equality of all of us. They saw that as not a contradiction, but as a fruitful and life-giving tension. It was no more a contradiction than it is when a tightrope walker sets out across a tightrope and has to keep his balance even as he advances forward. That's not a contradiction in tightrope walking. That's what tightrope walking is. That's the project and point of being a tightrope walker. And for John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor sitting on that bench, that was the project and point of liberalism and of being a liberal. It was to pursue both the liberty of the individual to express herself as fully as and in as idiosyncratic and eccentric a way as each of us are capable, and at the same time to use the instruments and institutions of society to create ever greater equality amongst all. When I was thinking about showing Olivia, introducing Olivia to this couple on the bench, a couple tormented even as they brooded on these ideas, tormented by their own destiny. Could she leave her husband and leave her children? She wanted to be free, but that seemed to be terribly cruel and unfair. Could he go and live with her in indifference to her previous ties? Oh, they were tormented by this for a very long time. And they finally worked out a kind of compromise where John Stuart Mill went to live part of the time with Harriet Taylor while her husband and children remained with her in another part of the house. John Stuart Mill paid all the wine bills and the husband paid the food bills. But they didn't think that there was anything shameful in that. They gloried in it. They gloried in the moral virtue of a beautiful compromise. And they realized that a compromise can be not a wishy-washy centrist gesture, but a knot tied tight between competing decencies. A contradiction enshrined in recognition of the contradictions of human nature. And as I thought about this couple, wonderful both in conduct and in concepts, it occurred to me that their favorite pet, their object, the rhinoceros, was the perfect heraldic symbol of the liberalism that I wanted Olivia to understand and be exposed to. Because if you think about it at all, a rhinoceros is the original real-world type of the unicorn. That's how the myth of the unicorn began. Travelers would go to Africa and they would see rhinoceros, animals, horn right there, and they would pretty it up when they came home. Make it sound better, make it look better. Oh yeah, it's gorgeous. It's got this beautiful silver white body like a horse and a long ivory mother of pearl horn. Gorgeous thing. And you get unicorns in legend and unicorns in tapestries and unicorns in fable. And there's only one problem with the unicorn. It doesn't exist. The problem with the rhinoceros is that it's ugly, it's misshapen, it's squat, it's the least glamorous animal that God ever created, but it has one enormous advantage. It actually exists, and it is formidable. And that's the spirit of the liberalism that John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor began and enshrined. It wasn't beautiful. It was made up of compromises. It was made up of tensions. It was made up of dreams that they knew would unlikely to be realized in their own lifetimes. It was a rhinoceros. But it was a formidable animal for what they sensed was that liberalism would get nothing accomplished accept everything eventually. I wanted Olivia to be there on that bench in front of that cage with those two remarkable people. But I wanted to take her to meet some other people too. I wanted to take her further back in time to a night in 1776 in Edinburgh, Scotland, when the great philosopher David Hume lay dying and was accompanied only by one man, by his best friend, Adam Smith. Now, David Hume dying was a scandal and an event throughout Europe because David Hume was one of the first thinkers publicly to declare himself an infidel, a skeptic, a free thinker. And everyone knew it, and everyone was sure that dying as he was, probably of colon cancer, by our contemporary taxonomy, that he would turn to the heavens, turn to faith at a moment of existential crisis. And he never did. He never did. He stood and talked and suffered and remained true to his principles. And he loved to talk to Adam Smith because Smith was his best student. What did they talk about in those nights when Hume lay dying? Well, I think we can be fairly sure we know some of what they talked about because Smith recorded it afterwards. They joked, they made fun, and they talked about the idea that Hume had originated and that Smith had taken up as a crucial social principle. And that was the simple idea of human sympathy. The idea that a society could be ordered and organized not around an authoritarian structure, a hierarchy descending from heaven to men. No, a society could be organized simply by our recognition of the spark of sympathy that flies from every human being to every other human being if it is not constrained by clan and blood and suspicion and fear. Now, I was giving this talk, sharing this vision not too long ago in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and just as I came to those words, a gentleman in the front row began to have a seizure and died on us right there. He didn't actually die, but it seemed to be. And at that moment, when I was trying to communicate this idea, everyone else in the front row came to his assistance, came to his aid. Didn't know him, total stranger, but everyone felt that impulse, both natural and encouraged in a liberal society like ours, to come to the aid of someone in difficulty. That seems to us self-evident, obvious, but it hadn't been obvious for a very long time. The notion that that impulse, that emotion of identification with our fellows, that we could make whole worlds out of that feeling of sympathy, that was new, that was alien, and that was part of what Hume and Smith shared on Hume's dying bed. Everybody knows, and you'll hear from brilliant conservative and free market ideologues like the great Milton Friedman, that Adam Smith really was the inventor of the modern idea or the modern ideology of the free market. And that's true. He wrote a great book called On the Wealth of Nations, where he introduced the concept of the invisible hand, how human beings simply following their own desires, their own material interests, will end up inadvertently benefiting all, that societies can self-emerge out of the instincts of the market. And he did say that. He did believe that. But before he wrote a page of that great book, On the Wealth of Nations, he wrote an even greater book before that's foundational to his ideas about the free market, about what he called moral sentiments, on moral sentiments. And what he meant by moral sentiments was exactly that instinct of sympathy. And what he believed was not that markets make men and women free. No, he believed that free men and women move towards markets. But he believed that building institutions of trust, he believed that in building structures of shared sympathy where we could come together outside the narrow bonds of clan and kind, of identical faith and identical background, that was essential before a free market could operate fairly. And it was an insight that tragically has been confirmed again and again in the post-Cold War period, when we've seen that if you don't have powerful, strong social capital, if you don't have strong civic institutions, having free markets only leads to kleptocracy. Smith and Hume, on Hume's deathbed, shared these ideas back and forth. And the last time Smith was with Hume and wrote down Hume's thoughts on the future was July 4th, 1776. So I wanted her to meet these two strange, extraordinary Scotchmen, and I wanted her to meet the couple on the rhinoceros bench, but I wanted her to meet other people too. There's another great English couple who are dear to my heart, who I think embody the fire and the spirit of the moral adventure of liberalism, not the narrow contractual side of liberalism, but its burning moral adventure. They're eccentric too, as Taylor and Mill are. You know one of them, but you probably won't recognize her instantly. I'm talking here about the great liberal journalist George Henry Lewis and his wife, Marianne Evans. Well, we know Marianne Evans better as the greatest of all English novelists, George Eliot. And she took the name George Eliot in tribute to the man she loved, her not quite legal husband, George Henry Lewis. They fell in love, like Taylor and Mill, a little bit later, historically, though Lewis was a disciple of Mill's. Lewis was a wonderful man. He's one of my favorite people in the history of liberalism. He was an actor, loved acting, crazy about the theater, wrote the best drama criticism in English between Hazlitt and Shaw. If you ever have a chance to read his theater criticism, he brings dead plays to life even today. And he was a man of such principle that he took it on himself to play Shylock in a production of The Merchant of Venice, which was the very first production on the English stage, which made Shylock into the hero rather than the villain of the play. But when he met Marianne Evans in the 1850s, he had one of those moments, the French call it a coup de foudre, a thunderbolt, when he realized, oh my God, this woman is so much more talented than I am. I should devote the rest of my life to supporting her and encouraging her to write novels and write fiction. And that's exactly what he did. She took his name. They couldn't marry because he had a previous marriage, and through a very complicated series of circumstances, his wife had 4 children by another man, by another writer, actually. Couldn't leave her because he loved the children. So they decided that they would simply start calling themselves a married couple, the Lewises. And Marianne Evans came from a very conservative religious family, and her brother wrote to her and said, who performed this ceremony that made you Mrs. Lewis? And she said, no one performed the ceremony. Said, I have become Mrs. Lewis. And they went through life in that Victorian period. Can you imagine? Would have been a daring thing to do in 1965. Imagine doing it in 1855. But they did, out of love and shared liberal passion. George Henry Lewis cut back on his work as a journalist to support her, but he became, because he was a man of immense encyclopedic resource, he became a science writer, got interested in the hard sciences. And he was the first person ever to articulate what I think is one of the key principles of liberal philosophy, as important as Hume and Smith's discovery of the autonomy of social sympathy as a way of organizing a society. And that was Lewis's discovery of what he called emergence. Emergence. First person ever to use that word as we use it now. You've all heard it used. We talk about emergent states, right? It's a familiar word to us. It references the way in which one level of reality, the elements in one level of reality, can produce a system that doesn't share their nature. What do I mean by that? Well, Lewis's favorite example was an obvious one. You have hydrogen and oxygen, and it makes water. But water has properties. We have a whole science studying water that are independent of the molecules that make it up. We understand that there's atomic physics, but there's also thermodynamics, and that the two operate according to very different rules. And that insight that you could have emerging systems that didn't depend on changing the elements within them, Lewis thought was profound not just for the physical sciences, but for the human sciences, for our understanding of human beings. It wasn't necessary to remake people to remake the world. We could live with our flawed, limited, often unintelligent, sometimes malicious selves, and yet still hold out hope for better kinds of social organization. And that was the vision, of course, that George Eliot put to work in all of her remarkable novels. If you remember Middlemarch, and Middlemarch, may I urge on you, if you read it in your 20s, read it again in your 40s or 50s. You'll be like it even more. But the whole theme of Middlemarch is how the heroine, Dorothea, remember her, starts off as a simple and rather yearning girl. She then becomes a hopeful wife, then becomes a horribly unhappy wife because she marries the wrong man, a kind of fraudulent version of G.H. Lewis. And then she becomes miserable, and then she begins to become a free woman, and then she begins to become another kind, and develops another kind of attachment. She ends the book in a wildly different place, and with a wildly different kind of wisdom about herself as a woman than she began it. But the system is one of emergence rather than epiphany. It's not like Scrooge's epiphany on Christmas Eve, which suddenly transforms him in a minute. No, that wasn't the kind of vision that Lewis and Eliot shared. It's the kind of transformation that happens through the course of a lifetime in common with the whole social world. Lewis devoted himself to a project, understanding that sometimes transformations have to take place through emergent systems, through not a liberalism of principle so much as a liberalism of processes. Devoted himself to the great project of British liberals, English liberals in the 1850s, along with abolition, and that was building a sewer, building a London sewer. Now that sounds like the single most rhinoceros-like, the single most unglamorous project that anyone ever took up. But they understood that there was a miasma of sewage rising from the Thames. They didn't understand germ theory. They didn't know why it was that there was a correlation between the miasma and cholera and typhoid, but they knew that there was one, and they understood that if you could get rid of the sewage, you might improve the public health. And they devoted themselves to the project of building a London sewer, not a shining unicorn project of utopian imagination, but a straightforward rhinoceros project of 1,000 small sanities, 1,000 small sewer pipes working together. It was built eventually, and by its existence saved tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, by its example for the rest of the world, probably millions of lives. That was the monument that George Lewis wanted to leave behind him, a functioning sewer. I could imagine, though, introducing Olivia to all of those old British people, and I could hear Olivia saying to me, "Dad, this is a terrific ride through history, and I'm glad to take it with you. And I understand why you love Mill and Taylor so much. You keep a picture of them on your desk, which I do. And I'm excited to hear about what Adam Smith actually believed, as opposed to what the Wall Street Journal tells me he believed. And I'm delighted to meet George Henry Lewis and George Eliot. And yes, I promise you that I will read Daniel Deronda finally next summer. But everything you're telling me," I could hear Olivia saying, "is kind of far removed from my own concerns, from my own passions and my own problems, from the struggles and the crises that fill our country right now, from the shocks and traumas that so freaked me out on that election night." And I would say to her, well, you know, there are liberal heroes more close at hand, not of this moment. You know this moment. You can look at this moment yourself. But for moments just preceding this moment. I'd want to introduce her to and have her meet, for instance, Bayard Rustin. Great man, not mentioned often enough when we tell the story of the greatest American struggle, the struggle for civil rights. He was black and he was gay. And as he said at some point, he was arrested and imprisoned 25 times in his life, 24 times for being African American and once for being homosexual. And that was at a time when it was not easy or immediate to embrace the gay cause, wasn't called gay then, into the broader civil rights struggle. Hard for us to believe now, but that was very much part of the spirit and the mood then. And he was excommunicated from Dr. King's side and from Dr. King's cause, sadly and tragically, until the time came when A. Philip Randolph and Martin Luther King wanted to organize a great march on Washington for 1963, and they realized, somewhat reluctantly, that only Rustin had the organizational skills, the ability, the acuity to actually organize a march, not merely talk about it, but make it happen. Rustin, who adored Dr. King, said once, "Martin is a saint, but he couldn't organize vampires to go to a bloodbath." And Rustin, sitting in a room in Harlem with a bunch of devoted kids, set about the task of organizing the March on Washington. What did that mean? It meant he had to find ways to get all the buses to arrive on a Friday night and then get back on a Saturday. It meant that there had to be enough sandwiches cut to feed all of the people who were coming. I could have called the book A Thousand Small Sandwiches in his honor. It meant that all of the hard, unglamorous, rhinoceros work of making social change happen was left in his lap, and he gloried in it and delighted in it until finally the march could happen and that perfect frame could be placed around Dr. King's great speech. No, Rustin was an extraordinary man, and yet at the same time, though he was imprisoned again and again, even once on a chain gang, for his activism, his radical activism, he never gave up on, never abdicated or renounced liberal institutions. He believed passionately in the value of liberal institutions, a free press, regular elections, redress through grievances. He once defined the three basic steps of liberal activism. He said they were constitutional measures, nonviolent means, and democratic procedures. Three simple dance steps that can help change the world. Oh, I wanted her to meet Rustin, and I wanted her to look back on the figure who, even earlier, illuminates Rustin's mission and Rustin's goal, and that is the example of the man I think of as the greatest American who ever lived, Frederick Douglass. Because what makes Douglass so extraordinary, and I could hear Olivia saying to me, "Dad, can we really believe just in your 1,000 Small Sanities? Can we really believe that process, building, procedure, increment can produce the kind of social change we have to have at this moment of emergency and crisis, of global warming and looming autocracy? Can that really be enough?" And I said to her, "It is and it isn't." And I pointed her to the example of Douglass. Douglass was the greatest radical prophet this country's ever seen, but he was also one of the greatest liberal politicians. He spoke out as the great orator, the great rhetoric maker of abolition in its most and its appropriately strongest absolute form. But at a crucial moment in his life, in the 1850s, he had to choose between the path of John Brown, a man of impeccable morality but dubious efficacy, and that of Abraham Lincoln, with all of Lincoln's quavers and doubts and compromises and at times even double talk. And Douglass embraced the example of Lincoln and the then newly born or emerging Republican Party exactly because he saw that the struggle against slavery could only be triumphant if it was built out of the broadest possible coalition, and that one could only make a coalition if one had a political genius like Lincoln's, which would enable you to pull together people of the most disparate ambitions and the most different backgrounds in one common, but not uniform, cause of social sympathy and compassion. And Douglass gave what was probably the greatest speech any American's ever given, the so-called 3rd of July speech. 5th of July, I'm sorry, in which he said, back in the 1850s, he said, at a time when many of his colleagues, many of his closest friends in the abolition movement were pointing out, as we point out to this day, with justice, that the Constitution of the United States was written by slaveholders to defend and protect slavery. And they said the Constitution is a document rotten in its inception, hypocritical in its enforcement, and hopeless as a blueprint for the future. And Douglass said, no, he said, the Constitution is a glorious liberty document. It has failed in its purpose because the people who wrote it failed to live up to their own principles. It has failed to serve us, not because the Constitution is wrong, but because we are too weak to fulfill its vision. And that idea, still with us, that it's our job, the job of the next generation of liberal activists, to fulfill and expand the vision of the Constitution, begins with Frederick Douglass. I wanted her to meet all of those people and to see that to be a liberal, to engage in the liberal cause, was not to be a narrow, temporizing centrist. No, it was to be as Douglass was, as Rustin was, as Lewis and Mill and Taylor all were, is to be a radical of the real, someone committed to the cause of radical reform, but with a firm sense of the realities of change and with a firm commitment to a pluralism of peoples engaged in making that change. And I could hear her saying to me at the end of it that my faith, my belief, my examples, my people still seemed too small, not large enough, not desperate enough, not edgy enough, not perhaps even violent enough to come up to this moment. Did I really have hope? I could hear her asking me, and this was no longer a question I was hearing in my imagination. It was a question I was hearing morning after morning as we read one day's dreadful news extending into the next, and as all of us have had to do for the past years since that fateful night, simultaneously living in a state of shock and of instant acceptance. We no sooner have our mouths gaped open in disbelief than our chins are nodding in normalization. And I said to her finally that I couldn't hold out undue hope. I couldn't provide her false optimism for the immediate or the practical, because none of us can do that. No parent can do that. We don't know what will happen. We live at a moment of desperate fear, of national emergency, and no one knows how it will be resolved. But I did tell her this. I said that one of the things that struck me as I worked my way through history, which I do out of amateur delight rather than professional obligation, one of the things that struck me was that though the history of humankind was one of horrific atrocity and endless war and strife, for the most part, human beings were pretty good at living with one another. And I thought about a great show that we had seen together at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. It's about 5 years ago. It was called Jerusalem 1000. And it was just about Jerusalem in the year 1000. And what was so astonishing about it was that it showed you the art and the artifacts of those three people who were living in Jerusalem then, Christians and Jews and Muslims. And the astonishing thing, given their history, is that for the most part, they coexisted, perhaps not happily, but steadily, so that there are Jewish goods made for export that seem to have been made by Muslim artisans, and there are Christian Bibles that seem to have been illuminated by Muslim artisans. There's a constant back and forth, a flow of trade and selling and living side by side that enabled all of these very different people to coexist in peace. Then, of course, at the end of that century, the Crusades begin, and massacre precedes massacre, creates massacre, impels massacre. All that liberalism, all that the liberal tradition that I had tried to share with her on that strange Disney ride, all that liberalism tries to do is to make that normal human practice of coexistence into a permanent principle of pluralism. All it does is to try and say our capacity to live in sympathetic peace with our fellows is not an illusion. It's not a form of weakness. No, it's the single best thing we do. And if we can take that normal human practice of coexistence and explore it, understand it, so that it becomes a series of principles of pluralism, then we can create societies, as we have done, that with all of their faults and all their innumerable flaws and all of their countless injustices and all of their endless inequalities, are nonetheless more prosperous and more pluralistic than any other societies known to man. That's not even a walk you have to take. That move from the practice of coexistence to a living principle of pluralism is 2 simple steps. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you. Thank you. Every night I'm out on the road and I try and give that talk with a different set of people and a different set of emphases. But this is always the best part of the evening, when I can open it up and take your questions, hear your dissents, duck down from your brickbats, accept one bouquet as it goes along. But I've spoken for a very long time, but let's try and have a little, I'd love to take a few questions. We have a mic here and a mic here. Gentleman here.
My understanding of liberalism is that a key tenet has been the importance of the free market, and that originally that was kind of a laissez-faire, and then later it evolved into maybe a well-regulated market but not overly managed. Is a free market still a tenet of contemporary liberalism?
Great question. Did everyone hear? Did everyone understand? Is the free market central to contemporary liberalism? It seems to me, and this is one of the themes that I enlarged in the book, and I am, of the many things I am not, a prophet, a pundit, a sociologist, a scientist, I am particularly not an economist. I'm not even allowed to do the checkbook. But what I would say is, certainly, is that, and that's why I mentioned Adam Smith in tonight's talk. Adam Smith himself never believed that you could have a free market outside of a context of what we would now call regulation, and without having already established what one of my other heroes, who I didn't talk about tonight, Frederick Law Olmsted, the great designer of Central Park in New York, who was before that a great journalist. Not many people know that. What he called commonplace civilization. He said, if you don't have commonplace civilization, what we now call social capital, you can't have a healthy society. And as I said earlier, I certainly think one of the lessons that we have learned from the past 30 years in the post-Berlin Wall period is that if you don't have strong liberal institutions, if you don't have strong social institutions, having free markets only produces the catastrophic kleptocracies and oligarchies that we've seen in Russia and in other parts of the once the once communist world. So what I say in the book and what I believe is to be true for contemporary liberalism, it's why when you say the Democratic Party is becoming more liberal, you don't mean it's becoming more free market oriented, you mean it's becoming more attentive to the limits of the free market. I think that we have lots of empirical experience on this subject, and it's plain that free markets produce prosperity with extraordinary vigor, and that they produce inequalities with equally extraordinary vigor, and that we have to work sensibly to reduce the inequalities while harvesting the fruits of that activity. That seems to me a question of modalities rather than models. It's the last thing in the world any of us should have a religious investment in, is economic models of equity. We know, I've had the great advantage in my life of living in a lot of different countries. I was raised in Canada, I lived for many years in France, sometime in England. I've known what that horrible thing, socialized medicine, is actually like. It's great. I've had babies, well, I haven't had the babies, I've watched babies being born under the American system and under French and Canadian systems. It's better the other way. But at the same time, I've lived in a heavily statist and bureaucratic country like France, and I see the limits of that. And there's reasons why the internet grew up in America before it did in France. So as I say, it seems to me that we should follow Adam Smith's actual example and understand that free markets are wonderful things, but that they can only exist in a context of much broader and richer social institutions. That's my liberal answer. Gentlemen here.
Liberalism has been good to me. It was why my parents were allowed to emigrate to Australia from Malaysia, and it's why America let me in. I worry that liberalism is at risk because of two things. When you let folks speak up, they may have grievance with, say, white people and males, and I think there's a strong streak of identitarianism that is pulling apart our liberal fabric on the left, and I worry about that. The other thing is, I lived in China for 4 years, and I worry that the democracy is at risk to a successful authoritarian state capitalism, and I wonder if either of those two things are things that we should worry about in terms of the future of liberalism.
Great question in both parts. A very ambitious question, and let me struggle to answer it. First half, if everyone heard, I think probably may have trouble. First half, gentleman was talking about the risk of what's sometimes called identitarianism or identity politics to liberalism. On the one hand, it's a kind of great fruit of liberalism. It's one of the reasons I mentioned Bayard Rustin, because we think of Rustin during his own lifetime being gay, or the beginning of his lifetime, being both gay and a civil rights activist was unaccepted. You had to hide the reality that he was homosexual. Now it seems to us terribly vital to identify everybody in terms of the intersection of their many identities. And as someone like Mark Lilla, for instance, has written a book against identity politics, saying that instead of having the commonality which liberalism should assert, it fragments liberalism into groups of squabbling sects, and that sectarianism makes it very hard to reestablish the commonality, the common causes of liberalism. It's a question I look at in some depth in my book, actually, and what I end up saying, and it's a long, complicated issue with many, many sides, all of them to be taken seriously, I think. What I end up saying finally is that it's possible and indeed essential for us to both have all have many identities at once. That's one of the things that liberal institutions and liberal societies can give us. That is, we can be Jewish or Catholic and be liberal or egalitarian or conservative or liberal. We can be, like Bayard Rustin, gay and African American, and also be an activist in the Democratic Party outside that identity. It's possible for all of us, I think, to have multiple and hybrid identities in a free society, and we should both respect everyone's identity and also recognize that no one identity exhausts any of us. Each one of us is the intersection of countless different lines and nodes of identity. The other thing I'd say is that the crucial thing about identity, there's nothing wrong with identity politics so long as you have enough identities to make up a politics. That is, you have to be able to include the people you're rejecting as well, which is, I think, the point you were making. So democratic politics can never be a politics of excommunication. I think that's fundamental. Excommunications belong to religious sects. They don't belong to democratic politics. On your second question, that's one of the biggest issues, I think, around. Did everyone hear the second question was that this gentleman has lived in China and seen an authoritarian model of free market, a free enterprise, succeeding to some degree and going on. I always say to my kids that they'll have the opportunity in the next 50 years to see one of the great experiments in human society, because one of the foundational beliefs of certainly of conservatism has always been that if you have free markets, that will produce free societies, and that seems to be the opposite there. But it'll be fascinating to see how that plays out over time, because one of the things we've learned through observation and through history is that what matters most are not necessarily what the government's doing, but what the people are doing, how much civil society is growing up. You know, it's one of the themes of my book, is that what really mattered in 18th century France was not what was going on in the court, but what was going on in the coffee houses. That's where the new consciousness and the new, eventually, the revolution and the liberal spirit was being made. So it may be what's going on in the Starbucks of China will tell us more in 50 years. But I share your fear about that authoritarian model among the many other authoritarian models that are that we have to be fearful about right now. Thank you for that. Gentleman here.
Appreciate the talk. I believe, as you do, in the project of liberalism and pluralism. I guess we learned in 2016, maybe it's always been with us, but it certainly came to light in a big way that we also live with people who don't share that. And so it's kind of the age-old question, which is, how do we, be plural with people who don't want to be plural with us, right? How do we tolerate those who are not tolerant, right?
It's a great question. You know, I think one of the greatest of all liberal philosophers, Karl Popper, Austrian and lived in New Zealand for a while and then in England, once called that the paradox of tolerance, right? How can we have tolerance with the intolerant? And it's a significant question. At a practical level, I think that our history shows us that the things come in waves. I wrote a long piece about Reconstruction, the Reconstruction period in the New Yorker not too long ago. And one of the truths about that period is that for a very long time, people were inclined to say that the positive gains of the very brief Reconstruction period, not just for African Americans, but for the nation as a whole, had to be discounted because of all the horrors and the rejection that came after. And Henry Louis Gates, in his new book, says, no, that's the wrong way to see it. And before him, the great Du Bois said, that's the wrong way to see it. Societies proceed in a snail-like place, short bursts forward and pulling back. I think that we can fairly, and it's the one place I think where liberalism can be absolute. We have to be absolutist about not being absolutist. We have to demand pluralism and tolerance. That's a precondition of living in a liberal society. And I don't think that that's something we need to apologize for or see as a contradiction. That's foundational to all of the good things that liberal institutions give you. And I don't think we need to be apologetic about it or fail to call out as an absolute evil every time someone in power calls the press the enemy of the people or implies that his enemies are criminals rather than opponents and so on. So I think that's all work that needs doing. And the hard part, and this is why I have limitless admiration for great politicians, the hard part is not finding the rhetorical energy to denounce the intolerant. The hard part is finding the pragmatic energies to persuade the intolerant to be less so. On the whole, as Dr. King said, that's the long arc of history that does tend towards justice in the long run, but I share your discouragement at the moment. Thank you. Gentleman here.
You shared your liberal heroes of the past. Who are your current liberal heroes who are in our public culture right now that you really admire and you think are examples of great liberals right now?
Great question. Liberal heroes right now. I should add, I deliberately wrote this book, this moral memorandum, to my daughter outside of contemporary politics. I did that for a couple of reasons. The impetus of the book is, of course, election night, and I talk about that. But then Trump disappears from the book, and I tried to remove contemporary politics from the book. 3 reasons. First reason is I wanted the book to have a little more life than stay on the shelves a little longer than that. Second reason, to be honest, because there are a lot of books about contemporary politics written by people who know more about contemporary politics than I do. If I have something to add to the conversation, it's a more eccentric sense of forgotten heroes and heroines and different shades and colors. And finally, because I wanted not to offer a program or a platform, but to affirm values, because I don't think you can have a platform or a program until you say to yourself, well, what are our values? Before we decide what our platform is, let's think about what our common values are. Having evaded your question, I will now try to address it. I see so many people, I think, let me do that terrible thing where you ask a politician, they would say, teachers. I think teachers are heroes. One of the causes that I'm most involved with at a practical, daily level is the cause to try and end gun violence in America. And I think the people who have worked on the Brady campaign and so on, against the longest possible odds and with the greatest possible discouragement, have done amazing work. And finally, now we're beginning to see that tide that seemed impossible to turn beginning to turn. I think Americans are learning what the NRA is really about. It's a long way to go still, but the people who have fought that fight against gun madness and gun violence, and so many of them who I've gotten to know are the parents of kids who were killed in gun massacres, for instance, Mr. Martinez and others. Having the moral resources to do that, to act for the good of the society when you've suffered that kind of loss, that for me is heroic, truly heroic in that way. And I just hugely admire those people. And similarly, the activists who've worked on the great scandal of mass incarceration patiently and for a very long time. I have a good business. I try and go in New York. There's a thing called the Fortune Society, a remarkable organization made for men and women coming out of prison, sometimes after 40 or 50-year stretches, and it gives them a home and a place. Again, that's rhinoceros work. It's not terribly glamorous. It won't get you on television, but it saves lives and changes lives. So those are my heroes and heroines. Thank you. Gentleman here.
You talked about having the biggest reach as a speaker up to the microphone, and I would say if you ever played basketball with Robert Reich, you would block every one of his shots.
An even tinier liberal than I am, but somewhat to my left.
Sorry, so. I had to bring that up. You wrote this book for your daughter, and I want to take you to my Thanksgiving table.
Uh-oh.
Contemporary, we're called elitists, and I really appreciated the intellectualism you brought to this. But I want to bring you contemporary and to other people. What advice do you have to us to persuade not the Trump voter, but the independents to come to our side? Help me with some word tracks for my Thanksgiving meal.
Sure. Well, that's a good one here. What do you say on Thanksgiving to the doubters who see you as an intellectual elitist and see our liberalism in those terms? 2 things. First of all, and here I will put myself in an obnoxious minority, I will never apologize for being an intellectual. I think that the business, to be an intellectual isn't to belong to a superior caste. It isn't to be born with money. It's simply to be someone who cares about ideas and cares about education. That's a commonality. I'm blessed, greatest good fortune in my life, to be the son of college professors. My parents weren't born as college professors. They were born as the son and daughter of immigrants who hardly spoke any English. And then they were lucky enough to go on and get educations because they were hungry for learning. That's what made them intellectuals. And that's talking about heroism. That's, for me, is a version of it. Never apologize for it. tell you an anecdote that helps me answer your question. So I've been talking about, I addressed a lot of this book to my daughter Olivia, but I have an older son, Luke, who's also comes into the book because he taught me a lot of philosophy. He's doing graduate work in philosophy. And he stopped doing it for a year out of a sense of citizenship to work on a campaign in New York City for Congress. Now, we all heard a lot about AOC and bless her and she's great and so on. But this was a much tougher campaign. It was for a guy whose name you probably don't know, named Max Rose. Max Rose was a veteran running as a liberal in the reddest district in all of New York City, kind of the Tony Soprano district on Staten Island. The last Democrat who had run had lost by 40 points. Lost by 40 points, and they had to try and turn this thing around. And Luke, my son, was crippled by his background because he didn't know what to say. He didn't know, knocking on a door, what do you say to someone who comes from a very different background? He had to learn a couple of things that I think maybe speak to your Thanksgiving table. He had to learn an unapologetic language of patriotism because very often he'd be knocking on a door of working class people who would have 3 flags on the porch. And one of the things that was true about Max Rose is that he was a veteran. He had fought in Iraq. You said that first. I'm here for Army veteran, Iraq War veteran, Max Rose. That was immediately got you in the door. I speak your language of service and patriotism unapologetically, and we speak it proudly. We're not elitists who look down on the military, on service. That in itself was a significant act. And I think more broadly, not just opportunistically or instrumentally, liberals, and I talk about this in the book, need to relearn the language of patriotism in an unashamed and committed way. That's why I like, without taking any sides among the Democratic candidates, I love Mayor Pete's idea for national service. I think that's something that we should all support, and gives us that kind of common language of patriotism. Patriotism isn't nationalism. Patriotism isn't nationalism. Patriotism is the opposite of nationalism. Nationalism is about how they're victimizing us. Patriotism is about how we love the place that we come from. So speaking a more credible liberal language of patriotism, I think, is terribly important. And the other thing is respecting people's values and not thinking that their values are diluted. One of the biggest mistakes, I think, progressives and liberals have made in America is to think that working class people, the famous Trump supporters, are deluded when they vote for Trump. They're not deluded, they may be wrong, but they're expressing their values. They're not expressing, all of us place our values before our interests. That's a fact about human beings. So you have to engage in a conversation about values, and I think you're likely to find a greater commonality than you think. All of the greatest liberal politicians, FDR, Barack Obama, LBJ with all of his tragic flaws, knew how to speak that language of common experience. And it's a glorious thing when you can do it, and it's much higher calling than being an intellectual or a philosopher. But I think that that's the way forward. Maybe the simplest way to put it is talk patriotically and don't be afraid to continue the conversation. Insist on having the conversation. That's the closest I can come to an answer for you. I think we can do one more question.
Yeah, if there is another question, we do.
There doesn't seem to be any more questions. I think we've come to the end. That was a great question to end on. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Be delighted to sign your books. Thank you. Thank you, thank you.
The signing for tonight is going to be just in front of the stage here. The line can go that way to my right. Books are for sale from University Bookstore.